that?
Oh, much better.
Okay, good.
Perfect.
Is it too loud this time?
No,
Okay.
it's great.
Okay. Well, it's great to talk to you. So
Oh, thank you.
I saw your article about the mass shootings and how in the wake of mass shootings, parents are having a reconsideration of mass schooling. And
That's right. Yeah. So after the Parkland shooting in February, the Miami Herald ran a story about how more and more parents were considering homeschooling as a result of that shooting. And then just earlier this week, in the wake of Friday's shooting in Texas, a news channel in Alabama had a similar story. I know NPR has been running stories about it as well. So I think it's top of mind. Not only just sort of homeschooling, but alternatives to mass schooling in general.
right, yeah, and that's something that I've been interested in. My work, I cover all the ways in which human beings can reconsider their participation in collective violence in all of its forms. So
Mhm.
that would include the idea that we have a right to compel people to surrender a portion of their labor to some type of service, even if they don't want to use it themselves or they, object to it in some way. And that's what public
Right.
schooling is. It's a monopoly of where you compel, and I posted this recently in Facebook, that can you imagine how crappy a product would be if an organization had the force of law to force its customers to use it?
Right.
And I said that's public schooling.
Well, and it's interesting you use that term, these terms around force, because sort of the origins of compulsory schooling in Europe and the Prussian model were based on military conscription. So it was
Right.
sort of this idea that we were going to bring people by force into military service, and then from there, because that was so efficient, the idea of compulsory public schooling came about. And of course, then in the United States, we replicated the Prussian model in enacting compulsory schooling statutes beginning here in Massachusetts in 1852.
Right. Yeah. Now, I encountered your work through our mutual platform of FEE, Foundation for Economic Education. But for those who are new to your work, please describe what you do and, in a nutshell, what you're interested in with your project here. I know you're dealing with unschooling. I am a little unfamiliar with that, but maybe we can expand it a little bit as we talk.
Sure. So I'm an education policy writer here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm also an unschooling mom to four never been schooled children. I became interested in alternative education and specifically alternatives to school when I was in college and did a research project on homeschooling. I was an economics major, but a minor in education, and became increasingly fascinated about education policy, which led me to graduate school at Harvard, where I focused even further on education policy and specifically alternatives to school. But it wasn't until many years later, when I became a mom and I was searching for education options for my own children, that I sort of revisited this idea of homeschooling. And it really resonated with my husband and me, and we decided that that would be the best fit. And then as I started along the homeschooling path, I realized just how much children are able to learn on their own without coercing them, without cajoling them, even gently, even enjoyably, but just really allowing them the freedom to learn by following their interests and supporting them with resources and assistance. And that's what sort of led me to self-directed education and unschooling.
Now, in your state, which state are you're in?
I'm in Cambridge,
Okay.
Massachusetts.
Okay.
Yep,
So,
Boston.
what are those requirements for you to be able to do this by law? Do they have any standards you have to meet?
Yeah, so unlike some states, Massachusetts doesn't have a state homeschooling statute. We have case law that guides regulations, but here we report to each district. And, for those of us who are in Boston and Cambridge, kind of these bigger cities with a lot of issues going on, they don't seem to spend a lot of time bothering we homeschoolers. I think they have a lot of other fish to fry. So it's really at the district's discretion what sorts of requirements and reporting. I submit an annual education plan to my district for each of my children. Same is true for Boston. Other districts have some other requirements. It's, again, all guided by case law, but there's some wiggle room for each district to decide how they want to interpret that.
So is there some kind of standard test that you guys are required to have your kids pass in order to get a diploma, or is that something you're not even interested in? I don't know how far the unschooling framework goes here.
Yeah, we don't have standardized testing is not one of the requirements. Districts cannot mandate standardized testing in Massachusetts. So again, that's from the state law. I mean, from this case law. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Is that the case in most states, or do you know what the?
I think it varies. No, I think that there are some states certainly that require testing either annually or regularly. And I think it makes it very difficult for families who are looking to provide some more flexibility for their children, who may not, feel like they want to push their child, for example, to read on a certain arbitrary timeline that the state or public school officials have decided is appropriate. And so I think it really does hamper parents' abilities to kind of follow their children's lead and do what they think is right.
Now, what do you say to people who they say, I'm a product of public schooling, so while I like this in theory, I'm just not suited to be able to provide the framework of the sufficient knowledge that I think my kid deserves. And I know government school's not that good, but I mean, I don't, so there's this whole thing about, I don't know anything about economics. I don't know anything about mathematics. I don't know anything about chemistry. I don't know how to dissect a frog. I want my kid to get some standard baseline information, and I just don't have the resources to figure it out myself. So what do you say for that? Because I think it's going to be a large segment of people who engage this idea.
Well, there's a couple of things. I think sort of flippantly, I would say, if you're a product of the public school system and you don't feel competent enough to at least teach your children basics, what does that about the public schooling experience that you had? So that's sort of the knee-jerk answer. But I think, there's a couple of other answers to that question. One is that in large degree, children will teach themselves, again, when they're surrounded by resources of the community. The internet right now makes education and learning so much more accessible, makes self-directed education so much more of a reasonable option for so many more people. So I think that we kind of underestimate the ability of children and all of us to educate ourselves, particularly now with the abundant resources that we have. But that aside, there's also numerous sort of hybrid homeschooling options that I think a lot of parents take advantage of. In fact, there was an article earlier this week in Forbes about the hybrid homeschooling option and how that is expanding in states across the country, where you're either in some cases tapping into public resources as a homeschooler, so you're doing some at home, some maybe online, and some of your own kind of eclectic homeschooling as a family. But other options would be more private, and that's sort of what I work with in the organization that I'm on the board of, which is the Alliance for Self-Directed Education, and we work to really support community-based learning centers, self-directed learning centers, and unschooling schools like Sudbury-type schools and free schools that make this unschooling and homeschooling option so much more accessible to more families.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can imagine. I keep thinking about how I'd like to, reimagine education as like a small mini. It should look almost like a little small theme park. Like, I was imagining a building designed as like a tree where people could come in there and have fun, but it's interactive and they can come and learn in a group setting and get hands-on and leave, so that it feels like you're going to a really wonderful experience. You just can't wait to get back. But it's not regimented for 8 hours or 7 hours a day. I was thinking of that myself the other day.
Exactly. And again, not to sort of harp on these online resources, but they're just so abundant and increasing exponentially. My daughter was interested in a fiction writing workshop that's being offered by Outschool.com, which is a online learning platform primarily for children. And, so she takes this weekly 1 hour fiction class and then does writing outside of that. It was completely driven by her. I thought it was might interest her and showed it to her, and she was all for it. But the class itself has about 10 kids all over the world. So she's talking to people from New Zealand and Australia and Europe. And so they have their own little mini community. So there's virtual communities certainly supplementing and complementing these real life communities. And then just, as I think I sort of allude to in the Fee article, this idea that mass schooling is really artificial. When we think about community, we want to think about something that's not compulsory, that's not age segregated, that's not sort of required in terms of this is the sequence of things you will learn at this point, regardless of your interests. I mean, communities themselves, I think, are much more authentic, and homeschooling really reconnects with that authenticity and providing young people with genuine community relationships.
So when people think of unschooling, that term, it doesn't mean that there's not boundaries, right? There are some boundaries. It's not like it's like a free-for-all. I mean, I guess there's probably variations on this depending on the parental philosophy of the parent. But, I mean, there is some structure. There's some guidance, and it's not like, okay, whatever you want to learn. Oh, you think 1 + 1 is 3? Okay, go ahead. That's what your imagination. I mean, of course, you always have to have room for people to have humor. But you know what I'm saying? Is there some... what is the philosophy of unschooling? Because I'm familiar more with the larger homeschooling and private school world, but not this.
Right. So I'll answer that in two ways. First, the kind of textbook definition, I suppose, of unschooling is non-curriculum based learning. So whereas kind of your traditional homeschooling would replicate school at home and kind of import into the home many of the expectations of schooling, the curriculum, assessment, and all of that, unschooling completely rejects that model and looks at learning and education as separate from schooling. But I mean, I think you speak to a really interesting point. Unschooling doesn't mean that you're never learning in formal ways. It doesn't mean that you're not taking classes and learning from teachers and maybe even doing workbooks, maybe even studying and taking the SATs, all of that. It simply means that it's being directed by you as the child in support, with the support of your adults around you and your community. Mm-hmm. So, there's certainly that piece. And the other piece about, is it a free-for-all? I think this is a really important point. I have a forthcoming book that's being published later this year by Chicago Review Press about unschooling. It's called Unschooled: Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. And I traveled around the country looking at unschooling families as well as self-directed learning centers and unschooling schools. And one of the main questions that I had for all of the people that I interviewed was, how do you balance freedom and responsibility? Or the term that one of the famed educators I talk about in the book, A.S. Neal, who founded the Summerhill School in England in 1921, that's still around today, he uses the term freedom, not license. And so it's this idea that, we can have freedom, but we can't have it to the extent that it's impacting other people's freedom. And that we have to balance that freedom with responsibility. So many of the learning centers and schools that I visited had clear expectations for behavior, for being part of a community, for chores. But there wasn't this sense of, no, you need to be coerced to do your math problems right now. It was learning as part of a community experience, and then finding that really young people are eager to learn. They're capable of learning that way, and excited.
Now, what about the collectivist perspective that we usually say, but we can't trust all these there's great people like us, they're smart and stuff, but there's a lot of families that have really crazy fundamentalist ideas or nut ideas or crazy pseudoscience stuff, and or they're have toxic environments. So I mean, they always want to control everything to prevent that. I mean, what's the way to respond to that concern, that busybody impulse? I mean, there is a legitimate thing there, but the idea that some crazy guy's teaching someone to be a Wahhabist or something like that next door, that's they don't say it that way, but I'm just saying in general, there's that. How can we trust poor little kids to what if they get a bad education from really bad parents or something,
Well, for one, I have a great faith in parents. I think for the most part, parents are the ones who are most interested and capable of caring for and educating their children. I think there are some parents that might need supports, and I think we can look at those supports and how we can provide resources and create non-coercive learning environments for people. But no, I think, if you're kind of comparing state to parents, parents are, in general and on average, much better able to care for their children's well-being.
Mm-hmm. How come there's not like a Starbucks or a Walmart? Like, how come there hasn't been a national brand for private schooling centers? Like, I've thought about some kind of hybrid between Amazon and Walmart. Of course, those both have bad connotations, but what I mean by that is the ability to go to little one-room schoolhouses or something set up on every corner, like a drugstore. And it's like, how come that's never been, or has that been tried? I don't know if you've done any research on that.
So there's a really great documentary called School Inc. that was put out by Andrew Coulson at the Cato Institute that addressed that very question and really looked at, why haven't these models of private schools that are highly successful, why haven't they been replicated? And they found that one of the real reasons why these schools are so successful is sort of their individuality and not scaling them. Okay. That said, I do think that there are a lot of innovative schools trying to replicate. And, certainly if you look at, like, for example, K-12 Inc., which is a virtual learning company, they are replicating in all 50 states. They have public and private options, mostly based on virtual learning. So, I think that there are some models, but it's hard to replicate things that might be working in one place and not another. I'll also say that in terms of self-directed education, and one of the organizations that I highlight in my book is Agile Learning Centers, which is a network of learning centers that kind of fall under this one umbrella, but each individual organizer and leadership team can kind of create their own strategy, their own philosophy, as long as it's sort of under this larger umbrella. So there are models to think about and to experiment with.
And what would you advise to kids who are maybe watching this or they're researching this, and they say, I can't get out of public school, I'm stuck here, but I want to be able to partake in this kind of revolutionary form of education? What do you say to those kids to help them out? Is there some...
Yes. One of the themes that kept popping up in my forthcoming book is the influence of Grace Llewellyn's book that came out in the mid-'90s, the Teenage Liberation Handbook, of young people stumbling across that book, often randomly and serendipitously, and it changing their life. They found ways that they could present a reasonable argument to their parents about why they should be allowed to leave school and move on to homeschooling and unschooling. And it was liberating for them, truly. So, I think that there are those resources. There's certainly the organization I work with, the Alliance for Self-Directed Education. But it's one of those things that they're, in many ways, they're the inmates, right? And so we have to think about ways that we can free them as their parents and guardians.
Yeah, that's the thing I think about, is just how many kids that, they're so angry and upset because they're put into an institutionalized situation. And I have friends that are on the inside who they're trying to be good role models, and that's important. There are nice, wonderful, great role models in the system, but ultimately it's like being a great role model, but you're still the prison guard, and you're telling them, get in line, raise your hand to go to the bathroom, this kind of obscene stuff. It's so disgusting if you really think about it, and yet you're treated like you're crazy just for raising the question. But it's changing. I think that the internet is really the revolution that's going to hopefully make this public school system and compulsory schooling laws an antiquated thing, like witch hunts. It's just something so archaic. We're going to laugh at how ridiculously long we kept it in place. But I guess our focus should be on challenging people to take the courage to step out of the system And it's like I've said before, people say, well, we cannot afford it unless, both of us have jobs and all this stuff, and so we have to send our kids to these 7-hour daycare centers and stuff. But there's just a lot of bad ideas behind that assumption,
Well, and I think if you look at the fact that we're spending over $600 billion a year in taxpayer money to fund K-12 public schooling, there's a lot of money there that could be redistributed, certainly, or could find some creative ways of re-empowering parents. Certainly education savings accounts are one possibility for putting taxpayer money back in the hands of parents so that they're able to make these choices by having additional funds that are their tax dollars.
And so, like you said, you could have a combination of some of it's done at home, unschooling, and then some of it is also a learning center, so that few hours they spend in these teaching environments. So it's not like they have to have someone there monitoring the kid from 4 years old to 18, all the time,
Right. And that's actually one of the reasons why, in many ways, education savings accounts are superior to vouchers, because vouchers just fund schools and help with tuition at schools, and education savings accounts, at least in theory, are funding education. So they could fund tutors, they could fund supplies, and they could also go towards tuition, even college tuition, depending on how they were structured.
Are there any bills that are currently in Congress that might do that?
I think it's at the state level. Okay. I know New Hampshire had a bill that was proposed that just failed by a few votes, but they're going to still keep at it. So I think at the state level, it's kind of working its way through.
I know that Ron Paul used to have bills introduced. I don't know if anybody's doing it now, or his son's doing it, where he would give you a tax credit based like $5,000 a year per kid or something. I don't remember what it was, but it was something interesting that would help you to send them to private school or homeschooling alternatives.
Right. There's lots of possibilities if we think about, thinking about creative ways to redistribute those billions of dollars in taxpayer money.
And what's so disappointing too, from a knowledge standpoint, I have a theory that I talk about that Thomas Kuhn was a scientific philosopher who had the idea of the paradigm shift, right? And this was the idea that when you have a science or some kind of body of knowledge, we assume that the average scientist goes into the field with the idea of questioning the entire foundations of the knowledge they're learning, but it's not how it's set up. It's designed in a way that reinforces the standard paradigm, and he called it a type of faith. There's a faith that scientists come into the field, whether it's chemistry, physics, whatever. And what happens to shift and have a paradigm shift is there has to be enough anomalies that add up on the side of discrediting that reigning paradigm in order for a kind of revolution, a process to happen where, similar to political revolutions in which everything looks so strong and dictatorial, and all of a sudden, boom, overnight, there's a new reigning paradigm. But the problem is, where I put an idea in, is the problem is that the state retards that cycle. They retard and slow down that cycle so bad that, all these problems that we've had a war on cancer since Nixon, and we still don't have any information. Billions spent. And it's like, that it comes from, the starts here with the education. This is the heart of all of that slowing down of this natural knowledge cycle that overthrows old dinosaur paradigms.
Well, and I think you touched on this a bit before, David, of in many ways, technology will be the great equalizer in terms of learning, because it used to be that you went to school because that was where the knowledge was, that was where the books were, the teachers had that knowledge and had those books, and you had to go there in order to access that. Now, with technology and the internet being widespread, affordable, available, it's much easier to take charge of our own learning and our own education and to empower our children to do the same.
Right. To me, the hardest part we have to face to really shift this is to change people's moral acceptance of a state monopoly on education. That's the really heart and soul of it. And I think the way we have to do that is to tell stories of the victims of public schooling, both the people who don't want to pay for it, they want to opt out, and then the sheriff shows up to mess with them. Those are human sacrifices at the foundation of this supposedly pleasant institution that we're not allowed to talk about. We're supposed to hide the bodies. We always hide the bodies of the people who are compelled to coercively hand over their little bit of fruits of labor that they're able to have after they're taxed to death, and then so there's this whole hiding of the bodies. And I think that art and storytelling, where we can tell the stories of people who get victimized by the system, both the kids and the people who want to opt out, I think that will be the thing that really does this old institution in.
Right. And what I always find so remarkable when I'm talking to people is they'll say, oh, but it's always been this way. Schooling has been like this for centuries, and this is just the kind of time-honored tradition. And say, no, it's actually a relatively modern social construct. Again, compulsory public schooling laws were created in 1852 and quickly replicated all through the U.S. and worldwide. But that's not that long ago. And prior to that, there was a whole assortment of different ways that people were educated. Some public schools, some private schools, charity schools, church schools, homeschooling was ubiquitous, certainly apprenticeships. So there was a much larger definition of education, and it was narrowed into these four walls of the schooled classroom not very long ago, a little over a century and a half ago.
Mm-hmm. I was when I was in school, I went to homeschooling, private schooling, and public schooling all. So I got a little taste of everything. And I think the key thing that I found to be the most important means of education for myself when I was a kid was the ability to have role models that you can imitate. And that goes to kind of a lot of the fulcrum of what I develop in my writing, which is I later learned about the work of a French anthropologist named René Girard. He had a theory called mimetic theory, which simply suggested that human beings, we copy the desires of those around us. And that's that imitation, and not just imitating like in a rote sense, like the way we posture or gesture or the way we dress, but imitating the perceived desires of those around us. That is the fundamental thing that makes us different from animals, is our ability to just almost like lightning bolt, just ping pong ideas and desire, our perception of what someone desires. We're able to absorb that almost magnetically. And I think that's the key thing about the unschooling paradigm that's interesting, is that you're allowing the the child to be able to find those positive role models and not feel like they're just being forced information like a computer.
Right. I mean, if you think about it, sending a child to school often makes their world contract. They're with, again, this age-segregated peer group, which is artificial. We don't find that in any other place in our society. With a few, the same handful of teachers every day. And that's just not the way the real world works. So I think many people who gravitate to the philosophy of unschooling acknowledge that it widens a child's world. You're making the world much more accessible to them, allowing them to interact with a whole host of members of the community, and then finding people, teachers, peers, mentors that connect directly to their interests so that they are working really in a learning community around what they're passionate about.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of like the idea that it's not so much about the facts, it's about the person who delivers it that they're going to become like, So I tell people, if you send people into situations in which they are in a setting with strangers who obviously many of them feel like they're overworked and underpaid. So they're going to mimetically absorb that same energy in the way their outlook on life is, which is, I better settle for being underpaid and overworked and disgruntled and taken advantage of, because teachers are taken advantage of. They are scapegoated by a flawed system fundamentally, where it's like they're supposed to be the babysitter and all that, as well as the counselor and all these other things that they're not able to do. But that to me is really the problem, is we're putting way too much emphasis on just memorize these facts and not enough on the why. So basically, public schooling, education for me is not about a product or a service. It's a way of life. You have an education way of life, to me.
Right. And I think as schooling really over just the past generation has become much more standardized and test driven, teachers are caught up in that just as much as students. And one of the things I found most interesting from writing my book was the number of teachers who became so disillusioned by what they were seeing in school, especially young teachers realizing how different school was even since they were kids, so not very, very long. And then feeling like there had to be another way. And the message that kept resonating throughout my research was that there were this sort of random encounters where eventually they might find an article or a book or see even a highway sign for a learning center, for example. And that was their entry point into thinking of another way of being educated. And then ultimately they started their own learning centers or became teachers in unschooling schools and that kind of thing. So I would just like to think about how do we make these less random? How do we help teachers realize that there are other ways to be educated and that they can be really part of that solution?
Right. There's always this thing that people say that, if we have your way and you allow people to opt out, think of all the good people who are going to be out of a job. And it's like, no, the good ones are going to find work in the new system. They're going to be very easy. They're going to be paid a lot better for a lot less ridiculous requirements. I can't name any public school teacher who is satisfied with all the bureaucracy-heavy, top-heavy administrators, people that have a job and they do nothing, and then they have to do all the work, and it's just this giant political, nasty, spiteful. No one's ever happy with it. It's a terrible system,
and certainly not why many teachers went into that profession. They wanted to work with kids. They wanted to be excited about discovering new knowledge together. And mass schooling simply squashes that.
Yeah, we spend more time valuing our ability to buy a electronic at the store or a coffee than we do the education that we're providing. And I'm trying to figure out how to snap the millions of people out of this collective bystander effect as their kids are thrown into the wolves. I mean, when you go into a public school system, it is a prison. It's not it's a prison. And, I don't know how to make people care more. I'm trying to figure that out myself.
And I think that's another really disturbing outcome of the mass shootings is that in an effort to make schools safer, they're actually making them even more restrictive than they already are. You're seeing headlines just in the past week and after any mass shooting about metal detectors and no more backpacks or clear backpacks or, taking away any of the small semblance of privacy that a student might have, which is minimal as it is, and making it even more prison-like. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of the pathology that leads to these kinds of mass shootings is because of the restrictiveness and oppression of mass schooling. Mm-hmm. So to make it even more so, seems to me that it might add fuel to the fire.
Mm-hmm. And it is extremely cynical process to be in that. I mean, why is it that we have it as a given that you have to go into a school and pick a group? There's all these different cliques and stuff, just like prison. Right. You have to pick a tribe and stick with it, or else you will be socially completely ostracized and vilified and left to your basically out in the wilderness like a scapegoat. And people, and then I hear people say to me, my kid needs to know what it's like to deal with the real world, like I had to go through. That's why I'm so pathological myself. That's why I'm voting for drone bombings of kids I don't even care about, because that's what, just stupid status quo thinking. But at some point, what language are we allowed to use to get it through their heads? Because to me, it seems like it is a kind of pathological thing. And it's like you can't be mean to people. You have to be sensitive to people, because when you're locked into group think, it's like a hypnosis. You really can't even reason with people who are locked into massive group think that has so much inertia in it.
Right. Well, and I think that's where the narrative that you and I write about and talk about is so important. This narrative of freedom that I've heard that same thing too. Oh, well, kids need to learn about the real world, but in the real world, if you're being bullied, you can leave. And in school, you can't. You're mandated under a legal threat of force to be in a compulsory schooling environment unless your parents liberate you. So I do think just kind of making certain people realize, what freedoms we have as adults that are so different from what most children experience, I think is a really powerful message.
And I think the key there, again, is going back to we have to teach the culture of the importance of nonviolence in all of its applications. Because the idea is that, in some ways we're kind of wrong. And we're right. It just depends on how you want to look at it. Because, when they say you're teaching them for the real world, actually that is the real world. The real world is you get arrested for every little thing. The real world is you can't drink raw milk without being put in a cage. So in some sense, they're just preparing you for college or, perpetual adulthood schooling, which is where, you get fined and citations for every little nonviolent, victimless behavior. And so they're conditioning them to say, hey, look, you're going to be in a prison situation your whole life. So here's your options. Here's your options. Pick a collectivist tribe that fits in with your sense of belonging the best. So you can be a nerd, you can be a goth, or whatever the things. I can't, what the new ones are. And then you subsume your reality into that tribe, and you fight. You fight for the preservation of your collective group. And you try, and you can do bad things, but just don't get caught. So that's the thing. Have you ever watched, on Netflix, all these shows they have about, drug wars and stuff? They make both the drug dealer's life really exciting, and then they make the cops really exciting. So it's like this societal-wide game of cops and robbers, and it's almost like they're advertising the romance of, hey, pick which side of violence you want to be on, And that's kind of the thing I think public schooling is preparing all of us for, is this sick kind of addiction to using violence and coercion to have our way, and picking a collective group which we can then hide our moral responsibility for the violence that we're doing.
It's interesting. I just finished reading to my 9-year-old son William Golding's classic book, Lord of the Flies, which of course is all about tribalism and savagery and brutality. And we talked about that, about, sort of creating these cliques, and the power of the tribe, the power of the group hides the brutality.
Right. And that's the thing, in the early ancient societies, we have evidence in archaeology that they had child sacrifices at the foundations of their cities that they established. So if we go back tens of thousands of years ago, we look at ancient China, ancient Mesopotamia, we see at the earliest levels of human development of temples or great walls, they would put children sacrifices. So what we're doing is a continuation of that. We are continuing to found our societies on our own privilege by sacrificing our children. Now, we don't do it in the same direct, violent way as they did, where you're killing people, but we are killing their ability to have freedom, and we're killing their ability to have self-respect by sacrificing them for some groupthink keeping up with the Joneses lie that we believe will satisfy ourselves. So at the end of the day, we have to grow up as a species if we're going to get this right, because there's no more need to sacrifice people, including our kids, for the least of these,
Right. I mean, that's where I think this idea of, and certainly the unschooling philosophy is about this. It's about freedom and self-determination, that you're able to chart your own course and direct your own education based on what interests you. And that works incredibly well when you're supported by your community and by adults that care about you. And that can look in different ways. It can be in your home, it can be at a learning center, it could be at an unschooling school, it can be in ways that we haven't even yet invented, and that hopefully we will invent if we can, as you had mentioned earlier, kind of disentangle education from the mass schooling monopoly.
Right. And once we get rid of that monopoly, we're going to be able to, it's a wonderful thing. Everybody should be for decentralizing the funding of schooling, because what's going to happen is it's going to open up the ability to actually improve on all these sciences on which education is keeping us held back through. So we'll get those cancer cures, we'll get those energy solutions solved, pollution problems solved, mineral production solved, transportation, all the things that we can't even think of yet can be developed once we unleash the human mind free from a coercive environment. So I appreciate your time. It's been wonderful. Where can we find your work, or any other final thoughts you'd like to share with us?
Yes, thanks, David. You can find me at wholefamilylearning.com. I'm also on Facebook at Whole Family Learning, Instagram, and Twitter. And it's been great talking to you.
Great to speak with you. Take care.
Thanks.